Miles Davis died with one regret. What he revealed will break your heart. In his final interviews before passing away in September 1991, the jazz legend who had lived without apology, who had never looked back, who had always moved forward no matter what anyone thought, revealed the one thing that haunted him until his last breath. It wasn't about music, fame, or career choices. It was something far more personal and devastating. September 1991, and Miles Davis was dying in St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, California. At 65 years old, the man who had revolutionized jazz multiple times, who had influenced generations of musicians, who had built a career on fearless innovation and uncompromising artistic vision, was facing the end of his extraordinary life. For those who knew Miles, the sight of him in that hospital bed was almost unthinkable. This was the man who had always projected invincibility, who had worn dark sunglasses as armor against the world, who had built his reputation on being untouchable and emotionally distant. Miles Davis didn't show weakness. He didn't express regret. He didn't look backward. Throughout his entire career, Miles had lived by a simple philosophy: keep moving forward, never dwell on the past, never apologize for the choices that had made him who he was. When critics attacked his music, he ignored them. When friends left his band, he replaced them. When relationships ended, he moved on. This forward momentum had been his strength, the driving force behind a career that had spanned 5 decades and multiple musical revolutions. But now, confined to a hospital bed with pneumonia, stroke, and respiratory failure slowly claiming his body, Miles was doing something he had never done before. He was looking backward, and what he saw there was breaking his heart. The first sign that something was different came during a visit from his nephew Vince Wilburn Jr., who had played drums in Miles's bands during the 1980s. Vince had expected to find the same tough, uncompromising Miles he had always known. Instead, he found a man who seemed almost fragile, staring out the hospital window with an expression of profound sadness. "Uncle Miles," Vince said, sitting down beside the bed, "how are you feeling?" Miles turned to look at him, and for the first time in Vince's memory, he saw tears in his uncle's eyes. "I'm thinking about things I haven't thought about in years," Miles said quietly. "Things I should have done differently." This was shocking. Miles Davis didn't do regret. He didn't second-guess himself. He had always lived by the principle that dwelling on the past was a waste of time that could be better spent creating something new. But as the days passed, and Miles's condition worsened, those closest to him began to realize that something profound was happening. The man who had spent his entire life moving forward was finally allowing himself to examine the emotional wreckage he had left behind. The revelation came during a conversation with Joe Gelbard, his longtime friend and assistant, who had been with Miles through many of the ups and downs of his later career. Joe had seen Miles at his strongest and his weakest, but she had never seen him like this. Miles had been quiet for most of the afternoon, staring at the ceiling with an expression that Joe couldn't read. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Joe," he said, "I need to tell you something that's been eating at me." Joe leaned closer, sensing that whatever Miles was about to say was important. "I've been thinking about all the people I hurt," Miles continued. "All the people I pushed away because I thought being close to them would make me weak. I thought I had to choose between being a great musician and being a good person. And I chose music every time." Joe was stunned. In all the years she had known Miles, he had never talked about his personal relationships with this kind of vulnerability. "The thing is," Miles went on, his voice breaking slightly, "I don't regret the music. I don't regret any of the artistic choices I made. But I regret how I treated the people who loved me. I regret how cold I was, how distant, how I convinced myself that caring too much about people would somehow diminish my art." What followed was a confession that revealed the human cost of Miles's legendary persona. For the first time in his life, he was acknowledging that his famous emotional distance had been as much a prison as it had been a source of strength. Miles talked about his children, Gregory, Cheryl, and Aaron, and how his obsession with music had made him an absent and emotionally unavailable father. He had provided for them financially, but he had failed to provide them with the emotional connection they needed from him. "I thought if I showed them too much affection, it would make them soft," Miles said, tears streaming down his face. "But what I really did was make them feel like they weren't important to me, like music was the only thing that mattered. He talked about his relationships with women, the 5 marriages that had ended, the countless other relationships that he had sabotaged through his inability to be emotionally present. Miles had always been attracted to strong, intelligent women, but his fear of vulnerability had made it impossible for him to maintain lasting intimacy with any of them. "I loved them all in my own way," Miles said, "but I never knew how to show it. I thought love was a weakness, something that would distract me from my music. So I kept them at a distance, and eventually they all left. They had to leave. I gave them no choice." The most devastating part of Miles's confession concerned his relationship with his father, Miles Dewey Davis Jr., a successful dentist who had supported his son's musical ambitions, but had never received much emotional acknowledgement in return. Miles's father had died in 1962, and Miles realized he had never properly expressed his gratitude or love. "My father believed in me when nobody else did," Miles said. "He gave me everything I needed to become who I became. But I was so focused on proving myself, on showing the world that I was tough and independent, that I never thanked him properly. I never told him I loved him. He died thinking I was ashamed of him, but the truth is, I was just too afraid to show how much he meant to me." The regret that haunted Miles most was not about any specific person or relationship, but about the systematic way he had trained himself to suppress his emotional life in service of his art. He had convinced himself that great artists had to be emotionally isolated, that caring too deeply about people would somehow compromise his musical integrity. "I thought I had to choose between being human and being an artist," Miles said during one of his final lucid conversations. "I thought vulnerability was the enemy of greatness, but what I realize now is that all that distance, all that coolness, it didn't make me a better musician. It just made me a lonelier person." Miles's medical team was puzzled by the change in their patient. Dr. Jeff Harris, who had been treating Miles for various health problems over the years, had never seen him so emotionally open. "Miles had always been one of the most controlled people I'd ever met," Dr. Harris said years later. "He had this ability to compartmentalize everything, to keep his emotions separate from whatever else was happening in his life. But in those final weeks, it was like all those compartments broke down. He was feeling everything at once." The people closest to Miles were devastated by what they were witnessing. Here was a man who had spent his entire life projecting strength and invincibility, and he was finally showing them the pain that his emotional armor had been hiding. Vince Wilburn Jr. later said that watching his uncle grapple with these regrets was one of the most heartbreaking experiences of his life. "Miles had always been this larger-than-life figure to me," Vince said. "He was the coolest person in the world, this untouchable legend who never seemed to be bothered by anything. But seeing him in that hospital bed, crying about the people he'd hurt, about the love he'd been too scared to give first, it made me realize that all that coolness had come at a terrible price." What made Miles's final regret even more tragic was the timing. By September 1991, it was too late to repair many of the relationships he had damaged. Some of the people he wanted to apologize to were dead. Others had moved on with their lives and had no interest in reopening old wounds. Miles tried to reach out to some of his children, but the conversations were difficult and painful. Years of emotional distance couldn't be overcome with a few phone calls from a hospital bed. The patterns of their relationships had been set decades earlier, and changing them would have required time and effort that Miles no longer had. He wanted to fix everything in those last few weeks, Cheryl Davis, his daughter, said later. But you can't make up for 30 years of emotional absence with a few conversations. I loved him, and I knew he loved me in his own way, but it was too late for the kind of relationship I had always wanted with him. The most heartbreaking aspect of Miles's final regret was his realization that his famous emotional distance hadn't actually served his music as well as he had thought. In his final weeks, he began to understand that the greatest musicians throughout history hadn't been emotionally isolated. They had been emotionally engaged. Their ability to connect with people had enhanced their art, not diminished it. "I thought I had to be cold to be great," Miles said during one of his last interviews. But Louis Armstrong wasn't cold. Duke Ellington wasn't cold. John Coltrane wasn't cold. They were all deeply connected to the people around them, and that connection made their music more powerful, not less. Miles began to see that his emotional armor hadn't protected his artistry. it had limited it. The music he might have made if he had allowed himself to be more vulnerable, more emotionally available, would have been different, and possibly even more profound. On September 28, 1991, Miles Davis died at St. John's Hospital. His last words, spoken to his nephew Vince, were about the regret that had tormented him in his final weeks. "Don't make my mistake," Miles whispered. "Don't choose loneliness over love. Don't think you have to be cold to be great. Music is about connection, not isolation." Those who were with Miles in his final days said that his death was peaceful but profoundly sad. He had finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of a lifetime of emotional distance, and the recognition of what he had sacrificed was almost unbearable. Joe Gelbard, who was with Miles when he died, said later that his final regret revealed something important about the nature of artistic greatness. "Miles thought he had to choose between being vulnerable and being great," she said. But what he realized at the end was that vulnerability doesn't weaken art, it strengthens it. The regret that haunted him wasn't about his music. It was about all the human connections he had sacrificed in pursuit of an ideal that turned out to be false. Miles Davis's final regret serves as a powerful reminder that even the greatest artists are human beings who need love, connection, and emotional intimacy. His confession in those last weeks revealed that the price of his legendary coolness had been higher than anyone realized, not just for the people who loved him, but for Miles himself. The man who had revolutionized music multiple times, who had influenced countless musicians, who had created some of the most important art of the 20th century, died wishing he had been braver about love than he had been about music. His final regret reminds us that artistic greatness doesn't require emotional isolation, that vulnerability can be a source of strength rather than weakness, and that the connections we make with other human beings are ultimately more important than the walls we build to protect ourselves. Miles Davis gave the world incredible music, but he gave us something equally valuable in his final confession: the understanding that no achievement, no matter how great, is worth sacrificing our capacity to love and be loved in return. If this heartbreaking story of vulnerability and regret moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that true strength comes from emotional courage, not emotional distance. Have you ever sacrificed important relationships for professional success? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out more stories about the human side of legendary figures.